Hey friends, welcome back to Useless Historian, the place where forgotten stories still breathe beneath the surface of time. Tonight, we're wandering back into a world lit only by fire and watched over by a sky that never blinked. A time before words, before maps, before even memory itself, when survival wasn't guaranteed and the moon wasn't just a moon. To early humans, it wasn't just a glowing orb in the sky, it was something more, something alive, something that noticed. In this episode, we're gently unfolding one of the oldest human fears, the silent belief that the moon could take something from you if you weren't careful. Not your food, not your shelter, but something deeper, something you wouldn't notice until it was gone. So get comfortable, settle in. Let's go back to the beginning and sit by the fire with the ones who looked up at the sky and wondered what was watching them back. And before we begin, if you enjoy these quiet journeys into deep time, I'd love if you'd subscribe. Share this with a friend who loves slow stories and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Now, let's begin. The night they hid from their own shadows. They didn't know the word for shadow, not yet. Not in the way we do now, but they knew what it meant when the dark shape clung too closely, when the firelight flickered low and the forms cast on cave walls stretched and twisted in ways no body should. When you sat still, yet something beside you kept moving, just slightly, just enough to notice. That night, the sky was too clear, the moon too round, and the wind too still for comfort. It was the kind of night that made old eyes narrow and younger ones stay shut tight even while awake. Someone muttered under their breath, low, rhythmic, a chant without language, just sound to break the hush that had settled like frost. No one looked at the ground. Not directly, not for too long, because the shadows had started to behave strangely. They didn't follow like they should, they shifted even when their owners didn't move. One child swore her shadow had turned its head when she had not. Another saw two shadows trailing behind a man who walked alone. No one laughed, no one scolded, because these things weren't new, not entirely. The stories had been told before, though never loudly. So they did what they had done in seasons past, when the world tilted in this particular direction. They moved the fire into the center of the shelter. They pushed it higher, fed it dried moss, bone, and meat fat, anything to keep the light strong and fast. Then they circled it, not shoulder to shoulder, but back to back, eyes outward, feet close enough to the flame that they could feel each other if something moved between them. Not one of them spoke, not one dared glance behind, because on nights like this, it wasn't the dark that scared them. It was the familiar shapes it stole. The older woman with the cracked fingernails scratched symbols into the dust just outside the ring, shapes passed from one generation to the next, meant to confuse the things that moved when they shouldn't. She didn't speak while doing it. Her lips moved in prayer, but the sound was kept in her throat. She pressed a stone into the hand of a child who couldn't stop staring at his own feet. "Don't look down again," she whispered. "Not until the sky forgets." A man farthest from the fire gasped, just once, sharp and sudden. His shadow had disappeared entirely for the blink of a moment, as if it had ducked into the earth itself. He didn't say anything afterward. He just shifted a little closer to the heat, eyes fixed on the flames, as if memory couldn't live there. The moon watched, and still the shadows shifted. By morning, no one would speak of it. They'd sweep away the dust with the old marks, grind the burned logs to ash, and pretend the night had been just like any other. But they'd carry it, each of them, quietly, the knowing that the night had teeth. That light too could play tricks, and that sometimes when the world was just a little too quiet, you had to hide from the part of yourself that never made a sound. Why they covered the fire when the moon was full. The fire meant life. It meant warmth when the breath came out in fog. It meant food, stories, safety. It meant light in a world where nightfall wasn't something poetic, but something you survived. The fire was the center of things, of people, of memory, of time. So when they covered it, on only a few nights, each turn of the sky, it was never done lightly, only when the moon was full, only when its silver light turned the ground pale and distant, and made even familiar paths look like they belonged to somewhere else. That was when they began to move with more silence than usual, when they spoke in murmurs, if at all, when they pulled thick hides and old cracked clay bowls across the flame, covering it until it smoked and sputtered, not gone, but hidden. And the children always asked, why? The answers never came in full, only in parts, in glances and gestures, in the way no one would look up at the sky once the fire was covered, in the way they moved their beds deeper into the cave, in the way the dogs, even the ones that had never been beaten, tucked their tails tight and watched the trees without blinking. It wasn't fear exactly, but it wasn't not fear either. One night, many turns ago, someone had broken the rule, left the fire uncovered beneath the full moon, a boy, young, curious, forgetting or never taught why the old woman always whispered her chant when the last light disappeared. And when he did, when the flame danced wild and gold beneath the white face of the moon, something happened that no one would describe clearly afterward, only that the next morning, the boy didn't speak, not ever again, and his shadow looked wrong for weeks, so now they covered the fire. They didn't need to see what the moon saw. That was how the old man said it. The moon watched too clearly, its light was too honest. The stars twinkled, they moved, shimmered, flirted with the dark, but the moon stayed still, too still, and it saw things no human should. They said the fire and the moon had once been siblings, born of the same breath, that they spoke a language too old to shape with mouths, and sometimes, if the fire burned too brightly under the full moon, it remembered who it had once been, and tried to answer. That was the danger. Not that the fire would go out, but that it would become something else, something older than warmth, something closer to memory, and memory to them was not always safe. There were stories about firelight reaching too far, calling down shadows that didn't belong to anybody, figures drawn to the rhythm of flame and moonlight in harmony, old things that lived in between breath and ash, shapes with names so old they had no sound left in them. So they smothered the flame with ash or cloth, covered it with care, as you would a child's eyes. They left only the embers, enough to carry heat, but never enough to dance. The fire was not to move on these nights, it was not to attract attention. One mother once told her daughter, if the fire moves, something will move with it. And that was enough. No one hunted on these nights. No one sharpened tools or scraped hides. The night of the full moon was a waiting place, a pause between inhale and exhale, and when it passed, and the moon began to shrink again, they uncovered the fire, the embers still there, patient, warm but silent, as if holding its breath the whole time. The children never asked again, they learned to listen to the silence, and the fire, the next night, would crackle again, but softer, like it remembered too. When the moonlight fell on the wrong child, they didn't know exactly when it started. There wasn't a scream, no storm, no sign written in blood or stone, just a shift, quiet and strange, in the way people looked at the child. The moon had been full the night before, clear skies, still air, and a fire, carefully smothered with thick hides, just as they'd always done. No one questioned the tradition anymore. Even those who'd once rolled their eyes, or whispered complaints, had long since fallen silent on those nights. You didn't challenge rules that old. You didn't tempt stories that kept returning. The fire stayed low, the clan huddled in silence. But the child, no older than 6 summers, had wandered out when no one noticed, just for a moment, just to pee, someone thought later, or to follow a moth with wings like bone. Either way, she stepped into the moonlight, and it saw her. No one saw it happen. They only realized in the morning, when she didn't smile. The girl who had once laughed through mud and snatched berries with sticky fingers now sat staring at nothing, not sad, not afraid, just distant. She blinked when spoken to, but didn't answer, ate when fed, but never reached out herself, walked when led, but dragged her feet in soft patterns. None could understand. They called it moon sickness, though that wasn't quite right. It was something older than a name. The old woman said the moon had picked the wrong child, that its light had slipped past the trees and found her skin when it was still warm with life. And that was the danger, warmth. Fire was always hidden on full moon nights, not just for the sky's sake, but to keep the bodies cool. So the moon wouldn't notice them, wouldn't choose, because once it chose, it didn't let go. At first, they tried simple things. Song, honey, feathers, water poured over her feet. But her shadow started acting strange, delayed, lagging behind as if it had to remember how to move. Her breath never fogged the air, even on cold mornings, and once a dog growled at her for no reason. A dog that had never bitten. That's when they knew. Something had been touched, and it wasn't just the girl anymore. One night, she began to hum, a melody no one knew, low, curling, without rhythm. But it made the fire crackle, even though no one had touched it. Just the sound of her voice made the flame bend inward. Another night, she laid her hand on an injured bird, and it didn't fly again, but its chest stopped fluttering, calm, still, dead, but soft. No one accused, no one punished, but they started stepping away when she passed, not cruelly, just less close. The circle of warmth shifted without words, not out of hate, out of old memory. Because this had happened before, always, it came back to the same story. The child marked by the moonlight, chosen, or taken, depending on who told it. Some said the moon gave visions, but the body paid for it. Others said the child was no longer fully theirs, that something else watched through her eyes, quiet and curious. One man asked, "Why her?" And the answer came softly from the shadows, because she was seen. On the next full moon, they didn't smother the fire. They let it burn higher than ever before, hoping it would hide them all. But the girl didn't step into the light again. She stayed curled beside the coals, blinking slow, as if waiting for a call only she could hear. And though they never spoke it aloud, everyone knew what had changed. It wasn't the moon's fault she was chosen. It was theirs, for not watching closely enough, for letting her walk alone, even for one breath, in the night where the sky could choose, and the moon never blinked. The silence they heard only under the moon. They didn't call it silence until they noticed its absence. In the day, the world was never quiet. There was always the crackle of fire, the shifting of hides, the murmur of voices or the scuff of feet against packed earth. Even the trees made their sounds, whispering when the wind passed, clicking when they dried, creaking in ways that made some think they had bones. Noise was part of living. You didn't think about it, you just lived inside it. But under the moon, under the full moon, the noise fell away in a way no one could explain. It wasn't just that people stopped talking. That was a choice. This was different. This was something that pressed down on sound. Something that made even the breath in your nose feel too loud. That made footsteps echo in your chest instead of your ears. That made the fire, when left uncovered by mistake, crackle in a way that felt like it didn't belong to the same world anymore. The old ones said the moon brought the stillness with it, not as a punishment, not even as a warning, just as a truth, a kind of quiet that didn't care if you liked it or not. A silence so deep, it felt like the sky itself was listening and had grown tired of hearing the same old sounds. That's why, they said, the silence was dangerous, because it heard you, it knew where you were. And worse, it made you hear yourself. When the moon was full and the fire was low, and no one dared speak above a whisper, the clan would sit, not around the flame, but near it, not quite touching. They didn't face each other. They looked at the walls, or their own knees, or the empty place in the shadows where the smoke went, and they listened. They listened to things that weren't supposed to be heard, like the slow pull of frost up a cracked stone, like the weight of someone shifting in their sleep. Not because they dreamed, but because the cold had found their hip, like the sound of bark peeling from a tree they thought was still alive. Sometimes they heard worse. They heard things that shouldn't have been there. The sound of a footstep just one more than the number of people present. The long dragging breath of someone who didn't exist. Once a woman said she heard her mother's voice, but her mother had died 2 winters earlier, and she'd never spoken above a hush in life. Yet that night, she heard her mother clearly, saying her name like it was time to come home. No one told her it wasn't real, because no one could promise it wasn't. They said the silence under the moon wasn't empty, it was full, just not with things you could see. It held memories that weren't yours, thoughts that weren't thoughts exactly, but half feelings that pressed against your chest like cold hands. Sometimes, people would begin to cry quietly, without knowing why, or they would tremble, though nothing had touched them. The silence did something. The animals heard it too. Dogs curled tighter. The wild ones stayed away, not out of fear, but out of respect. Not even owls called on those nights. It was like the world held its breath together, as if some larger rhythm had hushed them all at once, and the children, the ones too young to understand, didn't play. They sensed it. The weight, the shift. Some would cry without sound, wiping tears into their sleeves, confused at what they felt. Others just stared, not at anything in particular, but into the center of the silence, as if it had shape, as if it was watching back. In the morning, everything returned. Sound came back slowly, like birds testing the sky. Someone would cough, Someone else would laugh too loudly, just to make the air feel normal again. But for hours, no one spoke of what they'd heard, because they weren't sure they had heard it, because they weren't sure it had stopped. The silence under the moon never really left. It just stepped back, and waited for the next full light to fall. What the elders whispered before moonrise. They never raised their voices when they said it. That was the rule. Not written, not spoken aloud, but felt, known, like the way you know when rain is coming, or when fire is dying. The elders always whispered before moonrise, even when the day had been loud with laughter or full of the hammering of stones. Whispers were the right size for the thoughts they carried. You'd hear them just before the last edge of sun slipped beneath the trees, when the shadows grew long and soft, and the air felt thinner in your chest, like the light itself was pulling away. That's when they began. 2 or 3 old ones, sitting near the edge of the shelter, not in the center, but just where the firelight started to lose its reach. Knees drawn up, hands folded, eyes half closed, and they spoke, not to be heard, not to be understood, but to remember. The whispers weren't stories in the way the children knew them. They didn't have beginnings or heroes, no lessons tucked inside them. They were fragments, passed down like dried seeds in a pouch, nothing until planted, everything, if timed right. Sometimes, one would whisper a name no one else recognized, sometimes, a sound, like a breath through teeth, that made the listeners shiver for reasons they couldn't explain. Sometimes, they just repeated the same word over and over again, as if the word itself was a shield. No one interrupted them, not even the other elders, because they weren't speaking to the people, they were speaking to the night, to whatever might be listening as the moon lifted itself above the ridge, to the silence that had already begun to press at the edges of the air, not loud, but deep. The silence that seemed to drink in noise, to turn each word into something slower, heavier, almost sacred. The elders said the moon didn't rise the same way each time, that some nights it watched with interest, other nights it wandered, and sometimes, rarely, it noticed. On those nights, the whispers had to be exactly right. The wrong word, the wrong tone, and something would shift, something would remember you spoke. So the old ones repeated the right things, phrases learned from the ones who came before, words not written in soil or stone, but etched into the breath itself. They said the breath was the only place safe from being stolen. Young ones weren't supposed to ask about the whispers, but they listened, of course, they listened. They sat nearby, pretending to tend the fire, pretending to chew dried roots, pretending to trace the grain of bone tools with their fingers, but they were listening to the voices that didn't want to be heard. They were memorizing, trying to catch what shouldn't be caught. Some said the elders whispered warnings, others thought they were bargains, small, quiet trades with the things that moved only by moonlight, a promise of silence in return for safety, a name buried so another might live, a memory burned so the clan could forget the wrong night. Now and then, a whisper would fall too loud. Someone would flinch, a dog might whine, a child might cry out in a dream, the fire might pop too sharp, too sudden, and then, the whispering stopped. Not with an end, not with a conclusion, but like a rope that had been cut. One elder might stand, another might simply lie down and pull their hide over their head. They never explained, never answered the question that burned into every watcher's tongue. What did you say? Because saying it again might wake it, because repeating it might turn it real. When the moon finally rose, full, wide, silver as water and colder than bone, the elders no longer spoke at all. They sat still, completely still, eyes open, but unfocused, breathing steady, slow, like they were remembering something far too old to put into words, something they'd carried too long already. The children learned over time to recognize the shift, to feel it in their ribs, in their teeth. They stopped trying to understand and started to respect, started to sit a little straighter when the whispers began, started to look at the fire differently, not for heat, but for protection. Because when the moon came up, the world was not entirely theirs, and the elders, they were the ones who remembered why. The marks left after sleeping in the open. They always showed up in the morning, and they were never the same. Some were small, just faint lines across the arm or cheek, the shape of grass pressed flat for too long. Others were stranger, darker, like the earth had tried to take something back, a bruise with no clear cause, a welt in the shape of a root, the outline of a stone that hadn't seemed sharp the night before. There was a story in every mark, but most of the time, no one wanted to tell it. Sleeping outside the shelter was never a first choice. It meant something had gone wrong. Too many bodies, not enough space, or someone too restless to stay under cover. Sometimes it was a punishment, soft and silent, handed down without words. Sometimes it was a volunteer, someone saying, "I'll watch the fire," and meaning it, only to wake hours later, colder than they meant to be, skin tight with dew, and the earth kept its own memory of them. The dirt didn't forget where a spine had curved, or where a heel had kicked in sleep. Stones that felt smooth in the daylight became cruel by dawn. Even the moss shifted overnight, gathering moisture that clung to skin like cold breath. But it wasn't just the body that bore the signs. There were other kinds of marks, a stiffness in how someone moved the next day, a quiet behind the eyes. That long pause before they answered a question, like they were still listening for something they hadn't fully escaped. Some swore they dreamed differently when they slept in the open. Not dreams like stories, but feelings. Long stretches of cold light, the sound of branches moving without wind, the pressure of something sitting beside them that wasn't visible when they finally opened their eyes. They'd wake up with their breath caught in their throat, unsure whether it was the air or something else that had stopped it. And no one ever laughed at those stories, because everyone, at some point, had a mark they couldn't explain. Children especially were warned, don't leave the line of the fire, but they always tested it, just a few steps further from the others, just a little beyond the ring of warmth. They wanted to see the stars without anyone else around. They wanted to hear the silence, until they did, and then they came back different. The next morning, their arms were scraped in shapes they didn't remember, their cheeks were stained from tears they didn't feel full, and their eyes, wide, unfocused, watching something that had already gone. The elders didn't ask, they just handed them a warmed stone or a cup of root broth and patted the ground beside the fire. The message was clear, you came back. That was enough. Some believed the marks were warnings, that the ground didn't like being taken for granted, that sleep was a kind of permission, and the earth sometimes denied it, that the spirits of the soil, the wind and the old ones beneath it all left messages on the skin to remind the living that nothing slept alone. Even in the middle of a group, even beside a fire, even under the safest tree, sleeping in the open was still a kind of offering, a risk, a signal to whatever watched that you trusted the world to leave you whole. And it didn't always say yes. Sometimes the mark faded by midday, other times it lingered for days, not painful, but persistent, like a question no one wanted to answer. A ring around an ankle, a spiral of red across the ribs, a thumb-sized imprint at the center of a back, and no matter how many times they returned to the shelter, no matter how carefully they curled beside the fire the next night, that mark stayed a little longer, to remind them, to keep them small beneath the sky, to say you were seen. And the ones who had the most marks, they never slept far from the fire again. Why no one spoke during the waning? It wasn't a rule that was spoken aloud. There were no warnings, no commands, no carved symbols on wood or stone to remind them. But when the moon began to shrink, thinning from a full watchful eye into a sliver of pale retreat, people stopped using their voices. At first it was just the elders. They would fall quiet during the evening meal, chewing slowly, nodding, instead of speaking. Children would ask questions, and be answered only with gestures. A hand to the heart, a glance to the sky, a quiet, deliberate turn back to the fire. The message was clear, even if the reason wasn't. Soon the quiet would spread. Fewer stories were told at night. The laughter that usually drifted out from the edges of the shelters fell still. The rhythm of conversation, so normal during the day, softened to little more than breathing, and the occasional crackle of a log on the fire. Some said it was out of respect, that the waning moon was a time of remembering, not speaking, that it was when the ancestors walked the edges of the world, listening to see who still remembered their names. Others whispered that sound carried differently during the waning, that even a word meant in kindness could twist in the cold night air and reach the wrong ears, and so they stayed silent, not fearful, exactly, not all of them, but reverent. Still, thoughtful in ways they didn't always know how to explain, because during the waning, everything felt closer. The woods, the past, the things they no longer spoke of in daylight. You could feel it in your bones, not a chill, but a hum, like the air itself was holding back a breath, waiting. Even the animals behaved differently. The dogs wouldn't bark unless something was truly wrong. The birds stopped singing early. Deer moved only at a distance. Insects went quiet under rocks and bark, as if they'd all agreed on the same hush. The forest, normally full of sounds layered one atop another, thinned out until it felt like a room with the door barely cracked open. There were always stories passed down, not in this season, but before, about those who didn't keep quiet during the waning. About a young man who tried to sing the same song every night, louder each time, to prove it didn't matter. He vanished during the third night, his shoes left neatly beside the fire. No footprints, no scent, just the mark of ash in the shape of an open mouth, but no one told that story during the waning either. Only after. Only when the moon began to grow again. Others said the silence was a kind of invitation, that by withholding speech they made room for other voices. The voices of the trees creaking in the frost, of roots shifting under thawed soil, of old gods speaking only in the space between words. And if you kept still long enough, with no one to interrupt the air, you might hear them. The children, especially the youngest ones, struggled most. They whispered to each other under their hides, their words half formed, half swallowed, but even they learned. They could feel the weight in the silence. It wasn't stern, it was sacred. It asked for stillness the way a grave asks for quiet steps, not from fear, but from love. And always, there was the moon. High above, thinner each night, barely clinging to the sky. The elders said that when it waned, the world was remembering something, that the sky was pulling memory out of the earth, like breath, and if too many voices filled the air, the memories would get tangled and lost. So they waited, and in that waiting, something settled in, a deep calm, a connection not just to each other, but to everything that wasn't speaking either. Fire, wind, stone, star. The hush was not emptiness, it was fullness, held so carefully no one dared spill it. Only when the moon was almost gone, just a faint hook of silver in the sky, would one of the old ones finally murmur something, a single word, a name, a reminder, and everyone would nod, slowly, feeling the permission return to their mouths, their throats, their breath. But even then, no one rushed. They knew the quiet had given them something, and they were careful not to lose it too quickly. The first time the moon took a name, before it had a name, the moon was just a presence, a glowing wound in the sky, a silent visitor that changed shape without permission. It watched, always watched, but without ever speaking, and for a long time, that was enough. It needed no title, no label. The people simply acknowledged it by gesture, a glance, a point, a nod toward the horizon. But something shifted in the year the river froze all the way through. That was the winter, when food grew too quiet, in the woods. When the birds left earlier than expected, and the snow arrived in a single night, deep enough to swallow the prints of those who walked. That was the season when children were born in silence, and even the dogs curled into themselves without sound. It was also the winter, the moon never hid. Every night, it hung low, not the thin, hesitant crescent of quieter seasons, but full, round, unblinking. It cast shadows through the branches, made the snow glow with its own memory of warmth, even when there was none left. Fires had to be buried deep in pits to keep their light from offending it. Some whispered that the moon was jealous of flame, that it had once burned and forgotten how, and on the fifth night of that stretch, someone spoke to it. No one remembered who, maybe a child, maybe one of the women who always woke to stir the embers before the cold crept into the bones of the sleeping. Whoever it was, the voice rose up, soft, cracking from cold but real, and gave the moon a name. It wasn't a word from the normal tongue, it didn't belong to the stories, it sounded older than speech itself. But when it was said, something in the camp changed. The wind paused, the dogs stopped shifting in their sleep, the flames danced in a slow new rhythm, and every face turned upward. The name was not repeated. It didn't need to be. From then on, when someone looked up and whispered under their breath, it was not just the moon, it was her. It was that name. A name that felt like smooth stone, like water just before it freezes, like a secret remembered before waking. With a name, the moon became something more than distant. She became interested. She became close. The people began to treat her differently, not with fear, exactly, but with caution. They offered small things at the edge of the camp, bones bleached white, bowls of water left to freeze, bits of burned wood arranged in circles. When they walked at night, they bowed to her light as they passed through it, like slipping through someone else's dream. Songs were adjusted, stories were retold, and children were taught not to point at her directly, because once she had a name, it meant she could hear. It became said, much later, that before that winter, the moon had only watched, but after the name, she began to remember. She held things in her light, kept track. The elders claimed she marked those who disrespected the silence, that in her silver glow, she traced the faces of the disobedient and etched them in frost on the inside of their bones. Even the animals felt it. Wolves howled differently, less like a challenge, more like a question. Owls stopped hooting on some nights altogether. Insects, even the stubborn ones, stayed quiet under the bark of trees. The name gave the moon a place in the world. It gave her agency, and once something is named, it is no longer passive. It listens, it waits, it chooses. That winter, they buried more than they had the year before. But they also remembered more. Dreams became stronger. Waking thoughts began to carry echoes of things only seen in starlight. Memory, it seemed, was stronger in her presence, and so her name passed into the bones of the people, not in song, not in speech, but in silence. A shared knowledge, held behind the teeth, under the tongue. Some say the moon has had many names since then. Others believe that first name was the only true one, and everything else is just a way to keep it hidden, because names hold power. And the first time the moon took one, the sky never quite felt safe again. Why they thought it watched the weak first, they never said it out loud. Not directly, but you could hear it in the way they told stories around the fire, the way their voices softened when the light outside the cave turned silver, the way certain names were avoided after dusk, and how even the strongest among them walked slower when the moon was full. It wasn't just superstition. It was something older, something observed across too many winters, and whispered across too many generations to be dismissed. The idea that when the moon opened her eye, wide and round and still, she wasn't just watching, she was choosing. She was listening for the softest breath, seeking out the thinnest limbs, remembering the ones whose bones ached in the cold. They believed she looked first for the weak, not out of cruelty, but out of some ancient hunger, not to devour them, but to take notice, as if her light reached through the cracks in a person's strength and made the broken parts glow brighter. And if she found someone already fading, already unsure, already slipping beneath the surface of silence, she watched a little longer. It's why the old ones were brought closer to the fire, not just for warmth, but for protection. Why infants were wrapped in furs even when they were already sweating. Why the quiet child who never cried was the one they worried about most during full moon nights. They believed that silence was the moon's favorite sound. You'd hear someone mutter it when the fire crackled too sharply. Don't let her see you too still. Not because stillness was wrong, but because it was inviting. Stillness meant surrender, and surrender drew her gaze. Some elders swore they had seen it happen. That once, long ago, a young girl who had stopped eating, not sick, just small and tired, had wandered out into the silver night and never returned. Not a mark left behind, no tracks in the frost, just a single strip of hide she'd worn around her wrist, laid across the edge of the stone where she used to sit. Others claimed the moon didn't take people, she simply remembered them too clearly. That once her light had found you, you couldn't return to being unseen. You were no longer hidden among the crowd, you had been chosen, marked, and sometimes, even if you stayed among the living, some part of you belonged to her. It's why people moved faster in moonlight, even when exhausted. Why their hands trembled when building the fire ring just a bit too late in the evening. Why shadows cast by moonlight were feared more than those made by flame. The strong could ignore it, or pretend to, but the vulnerable never did. They could feel it, that long, unblinking presence, the way the light touched them colder than it touched anyone else, the way it bent around others, but landed squarely on their face, their shoulders, their chest. Some even whispered that if you stood very still, very quiet, with your back turned and your eyes closed, you could feel a warmth on one side of your neck, not heat, but breath, the moon's breath, testing, wondering. And that was enough to make even the proudest hunter look over his shoulder on those nights, enough to make the strongest among them lean just a little closer to the flame, or shift slightly to block the light from hitting the smallest child in the group. They didn't hate the moon, but they didn't trust her either, because every family had lost someone unexpectedly under her gaze, someone who was getting better, someone who just needed rest, someone who had been quiet for a little too long, and so they didn't name the weak, didn't call attention to them, didn't let them linger outside the ring of firelight, not because they pitied them, but because they knew, or believed, or feared, that the moon was already watching. And once she picked someone out from the crowd, she never forgot their face. The story of the man who looked too long. They say he was one of the first to question the light, not just to follow it, not just to fear it, but to watch it. Long after others had turned away, after the fire had been stoked and the skins drawn up over sleeping shoulders, he would still be sitting there, unmoving, eyes lifted toward the silver-white circle above, not in awe, not in prayer, but in something slower and quieter, curiosity. That was the first mistake, they'd whisper, not hunting, not wandering, not angering spirits, curiosity. It was never meant to go so far, not with the moon. The others had grown used to him, in the way a group grows used to any small oddity, a limp, a stammer, a different rhythm of thought. He worked hard. He laughed when they laughed, but something in him stretched further than their shadows did. At night, when the rest retreated inward, toward fire, toward each other, he leaned outward. Some said it was because he had no family left. That grief made his gaze heavier. Others claimed he was touched by something ancient, not cursed exactly, but seen, and not let go. The truth, of course, was quieter. He just couldn't stop wondering. Each full moon, he would walk beyond the outermost fire pit and sit alone on the slope that faced the open sky, and he would stare, for hours, until his eyes stopped blinking, until the moon moved behind a cloud, or the frost stiffened his legs, until someone came to pull him back. They always pulled him back, until one night, they didn't. That night, the wind had a sharpness it shouldn't have had. The coals burned down faster than expected. The youngest among them shivered even with extra furs. And yet, he stayed, farther from the group than ever, his silhouette just a darker cutout against the silvery sky. One of the elders watched him for a while, then turned away. "It's his choice," she said. But even she didn't sound certain. He didn't come back by morning, and when they went to look for him, they found only a circle of footprints around the place he'd sat, not leading away, just around, as if something had walked around him, studying, deciding. No blood, no struggle, just his pouch, left with the drawstring loosened, and a flat, round stone sitting exactly where his chest had been. Some said the moon had taken him because he'd looked too long, that her light had entered him through his eyes and pulled him upward, not violently, but gently, like mist being pulled from the ground. Others believed he'd seen something he wasn't meant to, that the stars had shown him a pattern, or a message, or a reflection, and his mind had cracked under the weight of it, and a few whispered that maybe, just maybe, he hadn't been taken. Maybe he'd become something else, something that still walks on full moon nights, watching, not speaking, remembering what it's like to look, and not be looked back at, until now, because from then on the children were warned, not just to avoid wandering at night, but to never stare too long, not at the moon, not directly, not fully, look once, look away, offer respect, not challenge. They called it the long look, and no one practiced it again. They say on nights when the moon is brightest, you can still feel his presence if you sit too far from the fire. That faint warmth on the back of your neck, not wind, not light, but attention. They say he's still watching, and now the moon watches with him. How they tried to blind the sky. They didn't start by fearing the sky, that came later. At first it was just the sky, a vast thing, silent, endless, and always watching. During the day, it was soft and blue and far away, and they could ignore it while gathering roots or following tracks in the dust. But at night it was a different thing. Dark, close, filled with stars that pulsed like slow, thoughtful eyes. They weren't sure what it wanted, only that it seemed to want something. Some nights it felt kind, stars bright and steady, moonlight like a path drawn in silence. Other nights it felt cruel, the stars darting behind clouds, the moon cold and suspicious, the wind sending ash spinning upward, as if reporting back. They began to notice strange things. How some children cried more beneath a full moon. How animals would not cross the open clearing when the sky was cloudless. How dreams grew louder when the stars were sharp and clear. And so came the first fear, not of the land, not of hunger, not of cold, but of being seen, not by a person, not even a spirit they could speak to, by something much older, and always looking. They didn't have a word for it, not at first, just a way of turning their backs, of drawing lines in the dirt, of leaving offerings not on the ground but on tall stones, as if asking the sky to look at those instead. But it didn't work, so they tried something else. Smoke. They began to burn damp moss, thick leaves, bitter roots, not for warmth, not for scent, but for cover. The smoke would rise and drift and blur the stars, and they felt safer then, hidden. They called it blinding the sky, and for a while it helped. On those nights the children slept deeper. The dreams came slower. The elders sat longer by the fire, their faces lit without sharp angles of starlight. Even the birds, it seemed, quieted. But the sky always returned. The clouds would clear, the stars would harden, and something in the silence would stretch again, long and low and watching. So they built structures, thin roofs of branches woven with reeds, not to keep out rain, not to block sun, but to keep out sight. They didn't speak of it directly, but they all knew. It wasn't the weather they feared. It was what looked down through weather. They even placed stones on top, as if the weight would matter, as if the sky would struggle to peer past a few flat rocks, and still, it watched. One night, the oldest among them, a woman who'd lived through more winters than anyone could name, stood in the middle of the clearing and stared straight upward. Her eyes were cloudy with time, her hands curled with age, but her voice was steady. "You see us," she said. Then she turned to the others and added, "It always has." From that night on, some gave up trying to hide. They said blindness wasn't protection, it was surrender. That maybe being seen wasn't the threat. Maybe forgetting they were seen was. But others didn't agree. They kept the smoke thick. They added charcoal around the camp edges. They rubbed ash on their foreheads at night, like masks for something that couldn't be fooled. And in secret, some built even deeper shelters, not caves, but holes, covered in hide and silence. So far from the sky, they couldn't even tell when dawn came. That's where stories turned strange, because those who stayed underground too long, they changed. Their dreams turned to stone and tunnel. Their skin grew pale, and when they finally walked under the stars again, they cried like children, not in fear, but in some ancient kind of recognition, as if they'd forgotten something important, and remembered too late. The sky was never blind. It had never needed light to see. It knew them by shape, by thought, by the breath they exhaled before they spoke. They couldn't hide, not really. All they could do was choose what the sky saw. In the end, the smoke thinned, the offerings stopped. The people stopped pretending they could block it out. But sometimes, even now, when the stars seem too bright and the moon too still, they still whisper old words. The ones meant to draw clouds. The ones meant to make the smoke rise straight, not to blind the sky anymore. Just to remind it they're still small, still watching back, still here. The things that went missing only at night. They didn't speak of it directly. Not at first. Things just vanished. Not during the day when they could track footsteps in the dust or listen for a snapped twig. Not when the sun was high and the sky was blue and every shadow had a shape and a reason. No, these things disappeared when the world was quietest, when fires were nothing more than warm hearts in the dark and sleep folded across the camp like a wool skin pulled tight. At night, the world made its own decisions. It always started small, a tool left beside a shelter, a slingstone once tucked inside someone's satchel, bits of food that were wrapped tightly, buried in the ash to stay warm and hidden. Then it was more, a carved bone someone had held for years, a hide they'd used through 3 winters, a charm from a mother to a child, gone by morning. They blamed wind, at first, or animals, or the forgetfulness that comes with hunger. But that didn't explain the quiet, or the way it always happened, only on certain nights. Nights when the moon was sharp and still, when the air didn't move, and the stars felt closer than they should. That was when the elders grew quiet. They said this had happened before, long ago, when the world was even darker. They had stories, buried deep in their voices, that hinted at it, of nights when things vanished, not because they were taken, but because they belonged to something else after dark, things that only the night could claim, things that remembered where they came from when the fire's light went thin. They said it was because fire borrowed space from the dark, that the warmth it gave came at a price, that for every night spent safe around a flame, something small had to be given back, not much, just enough to keep the balance. The children didn't understand. They clutched their sleeping mats tighter, hid their small belongings under arms and hides, but still things vanished. Sometimes it was footsteps that vanished, tracks that led out of camp and never came back in. Sometimes it was breath, the kind that should have been there in the morning, soft and slow and warm but wasn't. Sometimes it was voices, someone who laughed the night before, gone with no fight, no sound, just absence. And so they began to change how they slept. They tied things to their wrists with sinew, pressed warm stones to their chests so they would know if something shifted. The firekeeper began burning thorny branches to keep something, anything, from passing too close without a sound. But it didn't stop. So they asked, what was the night keeping? Not stealing, not snatching, keeping, because after a while it wasn't just things that disappeared, it was memories. People forgot what a missing item looked like, forgot who last saw it, forgot if it was ever really there. They began to lose more than objects. They lost parts of their own stories. A necklace someone swore had been passed down for generations, no one else remembered it. A hunting song, hummed by a father for decades, vanished from his mouth without a trace. Not even he could recall the tune, and worst of all, names, not of the living, of the dead. Names carved softly into the minds of the old, gone, like they had never existed, like the night had swallowed the name and the shape and the sound. That was when fear became ritual. They circled the fire with stones, burned wood that had been touched by the youngest hands, sang songs at the edge of sleep to remind the night they were still listening, still remembering, still here, because the things that went missing only at night weren't just bones or beads or blades. Sometimes it was truth, and the truth, once taken by the dark, rarely found its way back by morning. Why the moon was blamed for sickness. They didn't call it sickness the way we do now. They didn't have a word for fever or infection. Not exactly. But they knew what it meant when someone's skin went too hot or too pale. When their eyes rolled back and they spoke to things no one else could see. When a strong hunter couldn't stand, or a quiet child suddenly screamed through the night. They knew even then that something invisible could break the body. And when they didn't understand something, they watched the sky. It always came back to the sky. The sun gave life. They had seen it warm the ground, chase away rot, make green things rise from nothing. But the moon was different. It did not bring growth. It brought change. It rose when light was gone. And every time it came back different. Thinner, rounder, hungrier, always watching, always shifting, always returning after darkness. So they began to notice something. The worst nights, the nights of tremors, of cries, of strange silences from those who had once laughed, happened under the moon's light. When it was full and clear and close, that was when the fever took hold. When the breath grew shallow. When old wounds opened again. When even animals refused to come near the camp. They whispered about it at first, quietly, between mouthfuls of broth. When someone lay still and sweating beneath the hides, they would say it wasn't just the illness, it was the moon. That pale light on their skin was like a second fire, but one they hadn't made, one they hadn't asked for. And if fire was theirs, if fire was a gift they had learned to hold, then moonlight was something else entirely. Something older, something owed. There were patterns. The elders began to watch more closely. Fevers rose with the waxing. Madness came with the full. Nightmares deepened as the moon thinned again. And when it disappeared altogether, it left behind those who had survived, or taken those who hadn't. Some said the moon was jealous, that it saw the warmth of their fire, the closeness of their clan, the songs they sang, and it wanted what they had. So it reached out, not to take everything, but just enough, a single child's breath, a hunter's clear thoughts, a mother's steady hands, and in the next cycle, it would try again. Others said the moon wasn't cruel, just wounded, that it had been broken once long ago, and now its pieces moved through the sky trying to find themselves again. That light it shone wasn't power, but pain. And every time it passed overhead, its sorrow touched those whose bodies were already weak. There were stories of those who tried to hide from it, who built shelters deep in caves or covered themselves in thick ash to block out the silver glare. But the moon found them still, through cracks, through dreams, through the eyes of someone who stared too long at the night. So they started to change their rituals. When someone grew sick, they turned their bed away from the opening of the shelter. They placed stones around the fire that had been untouched by moonlight. They offered small items, beads, carvings, hair, to the river at dusk, asking the water to carry their weakness away before the moon could see it. They watched the sky not just for guidance but for warning, because by then, they didn't need proof. They'd seen too many strong arms fall limp in the glow of the full moon, too many calm minds lost to whispers that only came at night. Too many mornings when the fever broke not because it ended, but because the person had gone quiet forever. Even the dogs knew. On certain nights, they wouldn't lie near the sick, wouldn't bark, wouldn't breathe too loud. They pressed themselves low to the earth, and waited, as if something was coming over them all, not a storm, not a beast, but a gaze. And yet the moon never changed course, it never slowed, never softened, it just returned. Every time, and so they waited too. They watched the skin for sweat, They listened for strange mutterings. They kept close to the fire, and farther from the windows, they whispered the old warnings. Because even when no one else believed, the moon still watched, and sometimes it wanted more than light could offer. The path that vanished under silver light. It was the kind of path you didn't need to think about by day, worn into the ground not by design, but by memory, by feet that had followed it again and again, by hands that brushed the same ferns aside, by stories passed down like invisible trail markers. It curved just enough to avoid the wet patches, climbed just high enough to catch the morning breeze, and always led home. But the path changed at night, not because the ground moved or the trees shifted. It changed because of the light, the silver light. Moonlight had a way of remaking the world. It didn't just brighten it, it erased and replaced. The trees no longer looked like trees. They became still shadows without leaves. The earth no longer showed its colors or textures, just shape and contrast. What was familiar by sun became silent under the moon. Familiar paths grew stranger with every step, and some said it wasn't just illusion. They said the moon did something else to the land, something deeper, that under a certain kind of light, some paths simply vanished. It started with stories, not all at once, just quiet words between those who walked too far or stayed too long. Someone would say they left camp to fetch water, followed the path like always, and then it was gone. They turned back, and the trees didn't recognize them. The ground felt wrong beneath their feet. They couldn't see the bend they'd always known, or the flat stone that marked the halfway point. They'd step forward again, only to end up where they started, or nowhere at all. Most came back, but shaken, not hurt, but hollow-eyed. And every one of them said the same thing. The path disappeared when the moon was highest. Some called it trickery, that the moonlight played with the eyes, fooled the brain into losing its rhythm. But others said it was the path itself that fled, that it retreated like an animal, hiding from something it knew was watching, that the moon's silver glow wasn't just illumination, it was pursuit. The elders said there were paths meant only for day, that they were living things, these trails, shaped not just by footsteps, but by trust. And trust was something the night couldn't hold. When the moonlight came, the trail curled in on itself, hid its markers, held its breath. Some believed it was protection, that the moonlight revealed things better left unseen, spirits wandering, memories half forgotten, the outlines of other people's grief pressed into the ground. And the path, wise in its own way, didn't want you walking through those things, so it vanished. But others thought it was a test, that those who truly belonged to the land could find their way even when the path refused them, that it was the earth's way of asking, do you remember well enough, or did you only follow out of habit? There were rituals, eventually, ways to keep the path from slipping. Some would walk with a smoldering stick from the fire, holding it low, as if its red glow would remind the earth they meant no harm. Others would place small markers before dusk, a line of pebbles, a piece of bone, a carved stick, but by morning those markers were often moved, or gone. The bold ones said they saw more, that while walking under full moonlight, they found paths that shouldn't be there, new trails, curving away into the forest at angles that made no sense, leading toward places that had no names. Some followed them, fewer came back, and those who did never spoke clearly. They'd just say it was too quiet, that even the wind seemed to fear something, that the moon cast two shadows instead of one, that the trees leaned away from the trail instead of over it, that the stars above looked unfamiliar. The silence they carried home was louder than any tale they could have told. So people stopped walking alone at night, not because of predators, those they could handle, but because of the paths, because once a trail decided it didn't want to be found, nothing could bring it back until the sun did. And even then, sometimes it came back changed. They taught children never to follow moonlit tracks, even if they seemed familiar, especially if they seemed familiar, because the moonlight didn't just show the path, sometimes it replaced it, and no one knew where the new one might lead. Why, they thought it fed on dreams. It didn't hunt like an animal. It didn't growl or stalk or flash its teeth in the firelight. It didn't leave prints in the dirt or eyes glinting from the trees. What they feared most about it was how quiet it was, how it didn't take anything they could touch, only what they felt, only what they hoped to feel. Dreams, in the early nights, before people gave the moon a name, Before it was marked in stories or worshipped or blamed, it was simply watched. They noticed how sleep changed when it was full, how the warm, strange worlds behind their eyelids were harder to reach when the sky was bright. Some people couldn't sleep at all. Others slept too deeply and woke hollow, unable to remember where their minds had wandered. And some, rare but remembered, woke with screams caught behind their teeth and no memory of why. So the elders said the moon fed on dreams, not the big dreams, not the grand ones. Those belonged to the firelight, to the future, to children imagining what comes next. No, the moon fed on the small dreams, the quiet ones that came in sleep, the ones you didn't even know you were having until they were gone. They said if you looked too long at it, especially on the nights it hung still and white above you like an open eye, your dreams would begin to fade. Not all at once, just little by little. You'd stop seeing color in your sleep. Then sound would fall away, then faces, then movement, until one night your dream would just be a black, silent room with no doors. You would wake colder than you'd gone to bed, your breath stuck halfway down your throat, and feel something missing, and you wouldn't know what it was. They told stories of people who lost too many dreams, people who began to forget parts of themselves. A hunter who could no longer picture his brother's face, a mother who remembered the sound of crying, but not the child. A girl who woke with her hands clenched, but had no idea what they were reaching for. It was always worse in winter. The longer the moon had the sky to itself, the more it took. Clouds were a blessing. Storms were sacred. Anything to shield them from the stare of the moon when it was too full, too still, too hungry. Some thought it wasn't the moon itself, but what lived in the moonlight, that it was thin and silver and cold, slipping through cracks in the shelter, curling beneath furs, crawling into mouths as people slept. They called it dream thin, or soul silver, or sky hunger. They said it licked at thoughts like smoke curling toward food, that it tasted the edges of what people loved, not to consume it all, but to wear it down. Slowly, quietly, night after night. So they began to fight back the only ways they could. Some wore ash on their foreheads before sleeping, thinking the soot of fire confused whatever came in moonlight. Others carved symbols into the entrance of their shelters, circles with breaks in them, to show the moon it wasn't welcome, and children were taught never to speak of their dreams aloud on a moonlit night. Doing so, they believed, gave permission for that dream to be taken. Others went even further. They left offerings, small ones, on stones outside the camp, a scrap of hide, a song hummed only once, the last bite of food no one wanted. Trade, not tribute, the elders would say. Let it feed on something else, but nothing ever worked completely. Because the truth was, the moon didn't steal dreams, it made them drift. It made them feel far away, like thoughts trying to remember their own names. And by the time morning came, and the sun began to repaint the world in gold and shadow, the dreams had slipped somewhere no one could follow. Some nights, people would sleep in shifts, not out of fear for their bodies, but for their minds. One person would stay up, watching the faces of the others, listening to their breathing, murmuring small things, names, stories, touches on the shoulder, to keep them anchored. To keep their dreams from floating off into the sky, and those who did this, those who sat awake and watched over the sleeping, they were given the name Dream Keepers. They weren't always old, they weren't always wise, but they were steady. They knew what was at stake. They knew that the body could survive without a dream for a night, maybe even a few, but a person couldn't go long without remembering how to dream. Because without dreams, you stopped hoping. And without hope, you didn't fight the cold, you didn't get up when the wind rose. You didn't notice when the fire began to die, you just watched the silver light come in through the cracks, and you let it. The night they tried to hide their breath, there was a night when the cold wasn't the worst part. Not the wind that slipped through the woven walls, not the frost that crept up from the floor and numbed the soles of bare feet, not even the hunger that gnawed gently behind the ribs. No, what they remembered most about that night was the sound of breath, not because it was loud, but because they were trying not to make it. That night, the moon was too full, too bright, and the sky had no clouds to temper it. It looked too close, too watchful. The fire had been banked low, not out of carelessness, but choice. The elders had spoken with dry mouths and warning eyes. Tonight, the breath must be hidden. They said the moon was listening. There had been signs earlier in the day, birds not flying, a silence in the underbrush, the animals watching rather than fleeing. The kind of stillness that came before the world remembered something old and dangerous. The youngest in the shelter had tried to laugh it off, as young ones do, but the older ones didn't smile. They started patching every seam in the walls with moss. They doused the outer fire early. They checked the sky as often as they checked the ground. And when night fell, they wrapped themselves in layers not just of hide, but of caution. Inside the low dome of their shelter, everyone was arranged in a circle around the faintest embers. No flames, no smoke, just the whisper of heat. And in that ring, they were told, breathe only through your nose. Slowly, shallow. No exhale above the lip of your blanket. If your breath steamed in the air, it could be seen. And if it could be seen, it could be taken. No one asked what it was. Everyone already knew, not in language, but in memory. The moon was full of teeth, they said. Not the kind that bite skin, but the kind that gnaw at spirit. It didn't always come down to take. Sometimes it waited for you to offer, and your breath, your soft, unseen breath in the dark, was the only thing it needed to find you. They had no words for soul, not yet, but they knew what it meant to feel it slipping away. They'd seen it happen before. Someone would wake the next morning pale and trembling, mouth open like they were still trying to catch something they'd lost in the night. A warmth that wouldn't return, a thought they couldn't finish. They'd sit by the fire and never speak of what they dreamed, only rock back and forth, as if trying to breathe the world back into themselves. So on this night, no one slept deeply. They half dreamed in a tight, uncomfortable way. Every twitch, every sigh was held in. Children were told bedtime stories not aloud, but traced in fingers on skin. Words made of motion, not sound. Silence had weight. It settled over them like a new kind of blanket, one that didn't warm but warmed. When someone coughed, the entire circle shifted. Eyes opened. The fire was nudged a little, not to grow it, but to mask the sound with crackle. Then silence again, breathing again, but softer this time. They said the moon would pass soon, that this night was the peak, but they had learned not to trust the sky to follow rules. It was older than memory. It had moods, and tonight it was curious. One of the elders, a woman who hadn't spoken in 3 days, moved her hand toward the earth. Slowly, she touched her own chest once, then the dirt. A reminder that they belonged to the ground first, that if the sky was watching, the soil might still protect them. Outside, nothing moved. No footsteps, no wind, no animal calls, only light. It poured in through the smallest cracks, silver and heavy. It painted lines across faces. It shimmered on skin. It looked beautiful, and that was the danger. Because some said that if you looked into the moon too long, you stopped wanting the morning. You stopped remembering why you needed the sun. You let go, not out of fear, but because it made you forget you were afraid. So no one looked up that night. They looked in at the fire, at the curve of each other's shoulders, at their hands clenched in hides, and when they breathed they did it like they were hiding treasure. There were no visitors in the night. Nothing came scratching at the shelter walls, nothing howled or called, but they still said the moon had come close enough to listen. And when dawn finally returned, not loud or golden, but grey and tired, they unwrapped themselves slowly, let out one long breath all at once, like a spell breaking. Then they counted, not the people, the dreams, to see how many had made it through the night. Why hunters returned with different eyes? They always left with the same eyes, sharp, focused, full of purpose. The eyes of men and women who knew every bend in the trail, who could read the prints in the mud like words, who knew the language of birds when they went silent. Before they left, their eyes were steady. They belonged to the earth, but they never came back that way. When hunters returned, their eyes didn't land where they used to. They looked past the fire instead of into it, past the people instead of at them. Their gaze searched for things not present, things still moving in tall grass, things half seen between branches, things remembered more clearly than anything in front of them. Even after food was shared, after stories were told, after the last drop of marrow was scraped from the bone, their eyes stayed elsewhere, as if something out there still had a part of them. No one questioned it. It was known. The forest kept secrets, and those who entered it had to trade something. Sometimes it was a scar, sometimes a silence, but often it was the way you looked at the world. The first change came in the way they noticed sound. Back from the hunt, they flinched at soft noises others ignored. The scrape of stone, the shift of wind, the creak of wood that meant nothing to the rest, now meant something to them. They paused longer between words, not because they didn't have stories, but because they had too many and couldn't choose which parts could be told and which parts shouldn't be. Children watched the hunters from the corners of the shelter. They noticed the way their feet moved, lighter, slower, as if they weren't sure the ground wanted them back yet. They noticed how some refused to sit with their backs to the open, how others wouldn't sleep near the door, how one woman began waking just before dawn, every morning, not because she meant to, but because something inside her remembered needing to. Sometimes, they came back with more than meat, small marks on the skin, scratches they didn't explain, feathers braided into hair without comment, a pouch of leaves no one else was allowed to touch. One came back with silence, stitched into every movement. Another came back humming a tune no one recognized, and wouldn't repeat when asked. They'd left as people. They returned as something else, not people, but layered now, like their eyes held something just behind them, barely hidden. And the worst part, the elders whispered, was when one came back with the wrong eyes entirely. It had happened before. A hunter would return, uninjured, walking the same path, carrying meat, but the air around them was colder. Their words didn't match their mouth, their laughter was timed too perfectly. Something had worn their face, but hadn't learned how to wear their soul. The dogs growled softly. The fire pulled away from them, flickering too much. The children wouldn't sit near. And then, quietly, that hunter would be sent away again. With gifts, with prayers, with no return expected, because sometimes the forest didn't take people, it borrowed them. And sometimes it gave something back that only looked the same. Most came back different in quieter ways, changed in the marrow, in the way they held their breath just before speaking, in how they reacted to shadow. The kill changed them, but not always in the way the tribe expected. Some took longer to return fully, even after they came home. They'd sit near the fire, but not quite in its warmth. They'd smile at stories but not laugh. They'd offer meat first, as if trying to earn the right to be here again. One man spent 3 nights carving something into a bone, tiny lines, careful notches. When asked what it meant, he simply said, "It was watching." No one asked what it was. The fire healed them, sometimes, after days of sitting close, after voices reminded them of names and smells and shared food, the edge wore off. The distance faded, their gaze softened, but there was always a piece of them that didn't quite come back, a sliver that stayed with the thing they saw, or the thing that saw them. Because the hunt wasn't just chasing life, it was brushing against death. And when you did that, when you walked that close, you brought some of the dark back with you, just enough to remember, just enough to see things no one else could anymore. That's why they watched the hunters closely, even after celebration, not with suspicion, but with reverence, and sometimes fear. Because when they looked at you with those new eyes, you couldn't help but wonder, what had they seen, and had it seen them too? The child who was never the same again. It was after a storm, or maybe before. No one remembered clearly anymore. Only that the child had wandered too far, or not far enough, or just in the wrong direction, at the wrong time. He had been chasing a sound, they said, or a shape, or a glint of light. No one saw exactly what happened, only that when he came back he was quiet in a way that didn't belong to someone so small. He still answered when called, still ate when food was placed in front of him, but something was missing from behind his eyes. Something soft, something loud. He no longer asked questions, no longer laughed at small things. The bark of a dog used to make him smile. Now, it made him flinch. The warmth of the fire, which once made him curl beside it like a pup, now made him stare at the flames too long, as if waiting for them to say something. At first, they thought it was just fear. Children were delicate. The night was long. Maybe he'd seen an animal. Maybe he'd fallen. Maybe he'd gotten cold, and the cold had whispered something to him. But days passed, and he didn't return to himself. He sat differently, ate slower, blinked less. He stopped humming the little tune. His mother taught him to sleep. He slept, but not fully. Not like before. He never looked tired, only distant. One night, they tried to draw it out of him. His aunt sat close, handing him a small carved toy from before. It had been his favorite, a bear with tiny grooves for fur. He took it, held it gently, turned it in his hands, but he didn't smile. He said, "It doesn't move anymore," and set it down. They didn't ask what he meant. The elder tried next, sat beside him and told him an old story. One the boy used to interrupt with guesses, laughter, wide eyes. This time, he listened the whole way through, quiet, still, and at the end he asked, what happened to the ones the story forgot? No one had an answer for that. He began to do strange things. He would wake in the middle of the night and stare into the dark without fear. He would place stones in careful lines near the edge of the shelter, sometimes in circles, sometimes in spirals. He'd draw with ash in the dirt and brush it away before anyone could see. He talked less to people and more to something. Only he seemed to hear. His mother said he wasn't sick. Not exactly. His body was strong. He didn't cry. He didn't complain. But she said it felt like hugging a bundle of leaves instead of a boy. He was light in her arms but full of noise that didn't belong to this world. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't angry. He still helped with water, still shared food, but he never played, never chased the others. When the other children laughed, he just watched. Like laughter was something he had once tasted, but now couldn't quite remember. One day someone asked him why he didn't speak much anymore. He looked up with those wide, steady eyes and said, because they're always listening now. No one asked who they were. The elders agreed not to press him, not to frighten him. Whatever had taken hold, it hadn't harmed him, but it had changed him. And the old ones believed that sometimes a spirit didn't come to take, it came to show. The child had seen something, and part of him had stayed with it, maybe forever. Over time he grew taller, quieter. He still slept on the inside edge of the group, close to the fire, but never the closest. He still listened to stories but never told his own. The lines he made with stones became more elaborate. The dogs stopped barking when he passed. Birds didn't startle when he walked beneath them. Once during a hunt, a man was injured badly. The boy, now nearly grown, knelt beside him and whispered something none of them caught. The bleeding slowed. The man lived. When asked later what he'd said, he only shrugged and replied, "Not everything wants to hurt us." People stopped asking him questions after that, but still some nights by the low red of the coals they would watch him tilt his head upward, listening, eyes wide, as if someone was speaking to him from above the trees, as if the sky was telling him things it didn't tell anyone else, and maybe it was. Because after all these years he still hadn't laughed, but sometimes he smiled, and when he did, no one knew quite why. When the wolves howled in warning, not hunger, they were used to the sound of wolves, used to hearing them from just beyond the tree line. Short howls, distant yips, low rumbles that curled around the base of the hills like mist. The wolves were part of the world, just like the wind and the night. Predictable, dangerous, yes, but in a way that people understood. Most howls meant hunger. It was a sound you could read once you knew it well. You could tell if it was a call to gather, a lonely one calling out for the rest, or a sharp territorial bark meant for rivals. But this one, this night, the sound was different. It wasn't sharp or aggressive. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a summons. It was something else entirely. And it made the skin prickle on the backs of everyone's necks. The first howl came just after sunset, long and low, echoing off the stones in a way that felt slower than usual. Then silence. A long silence. The fire crackled uneasily in the center of the shelter, but no one moved. They just listened. Another howl. This one farther. Then another. Closer again, but thinner somehow, as if the sound had passed through something before reaching them. The elders sat up straighter. One of them, who had seen more winters than anyone else, muttered that the wolves weren't hunting tonight. They were telling someone to stay away. No one laughed at that. Not even the children. Later, when the howls started to overlap, not in harmony, not in unity, but with a kind of pleading tension, everyone understood something was wrong. Not with the wolves, but with the world around them. The animals knew something before the humans did. They always had. The old stories had warned of this. Not about wolves, specifically, but about the silence between them. About moments when the natural order paused, not broke, just paused, and nothing behaved the way it should. When birds didn't fly from fire, when the river made no sound. When wolves howled, not at prey, but at what they could not face. That was how it felt, now. The clan gathered close, not just for warmth, for confirmation. They looked to one another to see if anyone else felt it. They did. Even the dogs curled beside the fire, whimpered and flattened themselves against the ground, ears pinned back. One boy whispered, maybe they saw something, but no one answered. By the third hour of night, the howls had changed again. shorter now, more frequent. As if the wolves had grown frantic, there was no rhythm anymore, no coordination, just bursts of sound scattered in every direction. Too many voices, not enough space between them. Panic, some said, others said, warning. Then, silence, not peace, not sleep, but a stretched hollow kind of silence that pressed against the chest and made every heartbeat feel too loud. That's when the wind changed. Not the direction, but the smell, the kind of smell no one wanted to name. Not smoke, not blood, something old, something wet, like bark that had never dried, like bone left in dark water. The wolves did not return to howling. They didn't need to. Something had heard them. That night, the clan did not sleep. The fire was kept too tall, too bright, and they let it burn far longer than usual. No one scolded the boy, who kept tossing branches on it. No one asked for silence when the twigs cracked. The light was a shield, and everyone understood. And in the morning, when the mist hadn't lifted, and the air still tasted wrong, someone found the trail. Not a predator's, not a hunter's, just deep, slow prints. Something had passed near them, but not toward them. It had gone around, skirting the edge of their scent, as if it too had heard the wolves. They didn't follow the trail. They didn't need to know. That day they left food near the forest's edge, not as bait, not as offering, as thanks. Because sometimes even the wild things try to warn you. Sometimes even a howl is mercy, and those who survive longest are the ones who learn when to listen. The first time the fire fought back, they had always thought fire was theirs to control, for as long as they could remember, or at least for as long as the elders could tell stories. Fire had been a companion, a creature of warmth, of comfort, of protection. It was fed, yes, nurtured, yes, respected, but never feared. Not like the dark, not like hunger, not like the cold. Fire had rules. You gathered wood. You chose dry kindling. You stacked it carefully. You struck flint or preserved coals, and you watched it grow. It did not demand. It obeyed, until the night it didn't. It began the way many nights did, with a wind that carried the breath of winter on its back. The shelter was full. The hides hung tightly around the entrance, and the fire inside crackled steady. Children were already half asleep, curled like roots around their elders. Meat from earlier hung in strips over flat rocks, still steaming. All was well, but then the wind grew teeth. At first it hissed through the cracks, playful, tugging at edges. Then it pushed. Then it howled. And the fire, the same fire they had warmed their hands beside every night for moons, changed. It lifted, higher than it should, leaned, hungrily, toward the wall. Its colors shifted from red and gold to blue and white at the base, and then it moved. Not like fire should, not with the lazy wave of a campfire breeze, but quick, jerked, like it had smelled something. It wanted more than wood, someone shouted. The dogs barked, then bolted. The old hunter, the one who had always calmed the flame when it rose too high, reached for the water pouch. But the fire was faster. It snapped sideways, catching the fur-lined edge of a hanging pelt. One spark, no larger than a fingertip, flared against the hide and clung. Not smoldering, growing. It danced in place, then split into two, then four, crawling like something alive across the fur. The air changed. The smoke thickened, not grey, black, bitter. Then they weren't feeding the fire anymore. They were fighting it. There was panic, yes. Not the kind that makes people scream, but the kind that makes them forget. They forgot the rules, forgot the steps. Someone threw a whole log onto it, hoping it would snuff it, not realizing it only gave it more to chew. Someone tried to beat it down with a blanket. The blanket caught. It was chaos without sound. Just the roar of heat, and the cracking of old branches that had once been walls. They fled, some crawling, some carrying. The children were pulled out first. The old woman with the frostbitten toes had to be dragged. She coughed so hard she couldn't breathe. The world turned red and gold, and choking grey. Outside, the cold returned with no apology. The fire inside the shelter roared as if it had always wanted this moment. Not to be tamed, not to be contained, to be wild again. It spilled upward through the cracks in the roof, and licked the stars, and for the first time in memory, the clan saw what fire looked like when it didn't need them. It didn't need them at all. And still, none of them could look away. There was a kind of awe in the fear, the realization that fire was not a pet, but a force, that it had chosen, once, to be gentle, that it could have always taken more, and that night, it had. When morning came, what was left of the shelter was blackened bone and ash. The rocks had split from heat, the fur, the food, the woven things, all gone. Nothing usable, nothing warm, but the fire too was gone. All that remained were coals, faintly pulsing, like the memory of a heartbeat. They didn't rebuild right away. They waited, not out of laziness, not out of grief, but out of respect. They had learned something ancient, something not written, not spoken, but remembered now in their bodies, in their smoke-stung lungs, in the way their skin still smelled like scorched hair. Fire was not theirs. It had simply been walking with them for a time, and that time could end, at any moment. From that night on, they never called it the fire again. They called it the one who stayed, until it didn't. Why they never slept facing the moon? They never said it outright. Not in the way rules were usually passed down. Not like don't leave the meat uncovered, or don't drink from the river at Thor. This rule lived differently. It was shown, not told, taught in the shape of sleeping bodies, the curl of spines, the direction heads faced when the furs were drawn close. No one slept with their face turned to the moon. Not because of superstition, not exactly. It was older than that. Deeper, something remembered in the bones, not the mind. Even the smallest children, the ones who had never heard the stories or seen what happened during the long moons, still turned away without knowing why. It was instinct, like pulling your hand back from flame. Something about the moon's gaze felt too knowing, too hungry. On moonless nights, people slept easier. The dark was familiar, a blanket, not a threat. You could hide in darkness. You could become part of it. But when the moon was full and bright and high in the sky, it was different. It lit up everything. Shadows vanished. Secrets had nowhere to rest. And those who slept facing the moon, they didn't rest either. There were stories, of course, quiet ones. The kind whispered while stirring broth or skinning roots. A cousin who spoke in her sleep only under full moons. A brother who began walking without waking. An elder who once opened his eyes in the middle of the night, face to the sky, lips moving with words no one recognized. He never spoke again, after that, just sat near the fire, looking at the ground, never raising his gaze once the sun set. No one blamed the moon out loud, but no one dared test it either. The old ones said the moon remembered things we'd forgotten, that it carried the weight of nights before fire, that it had seen the first fear, before language, before tools, and had never stopped watching, that its light was not warmth, but reflection, cold memory, that to sleep facing it was to offer your dreams to something older than story. So they learned to build their shelters with care, to place the sleeping spaces where the moonlight could not reach, to use moss and hides and ash-darkened walls to block even the suggestion of silver light. If someone woke up sweating, eyes wide, no one asked what they'd seen. They simply turned them gently, pulled the furs tighter, and lit more coals. The moon was beautiful, yes, but not trusted. Its silence was not like the dark's. It was louder somehow, a silence that pressed, that asked, that listened. And sometimes people felt it listening too closely. They told of a girl once who insisted on facing it, who said the moon whispered to her, that it told her where to find water, which berries were safe. For a while the others believed she was blessed, but then she stopped sleeping entirely. Her eyes grew hollow, her skin pale. She smiled too often at nothing. One night she walked into the clearing, and didn't return. Her tracks led into the open, not into the woods, just into moonlight, and then disappeared. After that, no one called it a blessing again. Even on nights when the moon was hidden by clouds, they faced away, just in case. It wasn't about the light anymore. It was about what the light might see. Some said dreams became strange under its gaze, too clear, too sharp, that your ancestors looked back at you in them, but not with kindness, that memories turned wrong, like they'd been stirred by a stick, that sometimes the moon showed you things that hadn't happened, yet felt like they had, and once you'd seen them, you couldn't unsee. There were patterns too. The elders watched who slept well and who didn't, who woke up breathless, who forgot their own name for a moment, when the firelight touched their face, and more often than not, it was those who had let the moonlight fall across their skin. So the rules stayed. No one made a ceremony of it. No chants, no warnings carved into wood, just a quiet decision, night after night, a turn of the body, a curl of the back, a silent request for peace, as if to say, not tonight, not me. look somewhere else, because the moon didn't need an invitation, only a face, and they weren't willing to give it theirs. The cave that closed its mouth at moonrise. They never called it a cave. Not directly. It had names, but none that meant place or rock or even shelter. They spoke of it in gestures, a hand cupped toward the body, a slow exhale, a glance toward the hills that didn't quite meet your eyes. If they had to name it aloud, they called it the place where the breathing stopped. During the day, it looked like any other hollow in the stone. A wide mouth, draped in long moss, curved just enough to keep out rain and wind. Birds sometimes flew past it, skirted it without alarm. Even small creatures nested near the edge of its shadow. It wasn't hostile, not until night. Not until the moon rose, because then, the cave would close. Not with a sound. Not like falling rock or tumbling stone. It was subtler. The change began in the air. You'd feel it before you saw it. A pressure, like the space around your chest had tightened. The air grew still, not like quiet, but like waiting. Fire didn't like to burn there after dark. Flames would flicker strangely. Smoke refused to rise straight, and sound folded in on itself. Even the breath of those inside came out shallow. They said the cave had lungs once, that before the moon grew jealous, it had been alive, that its breath had warmed the ground nearby, kept frost away from the roots. But the story went, one night, when the sky was all silver, the cave took in a breath, and never let it go. Since then, it remained half shut, half listening. Those who stayed there too long after moonrise came back different, if they came back at all. The clan remembered one man clearly, a scout, strong, proud, clever with snares and fast on foot. He laughed easily, remembered everyone's name, always found the dry wood even in rain. But one night, he insisted on staying in the cave to watch the stars. He said it felt like a good place, that the rocks hummed softly when he touched them, that the wind carried voices that knew him. They found him the next morning, sitting upright at the mouth, alive, eyes open, but not seeing. He blinked, and breathed, and moved like someone taught how to act like a man. But whatever was inside, had gone missing, or had been replaced. He never spoke again, and when someone tried to guide him back to the fire, he flinched from the touch, like the warmth burned. They buried him with care the following spring, after he wandered into the river one morning, and didn't try to come back. After that, the cave was treated differently. People left offerings at the mouth, charred bones, old beads, bits of woven string, nothing too valuable, but always something touched by breath, something alive. They believed the cave remembered what it was, that maybe, just maybe, it wanted to be something else again, but only in the sun, never by the moon. Because when the moon rose, it was as if the cave remembered the promise it had once made, to hold something, to keep it hidden, to never let it out. The entrance seemed to shrink with moonlight. The shadows grew longer, yes, but they also grew wrong. Angles that didn't match the shape of stone, darkness that didn't fall backward, but inward. You couldn't see past the threshold, not because your eyes failed, but because the space refused to show itself. One elder said the cave had made a deal, that the moon needed a place to rest its darker thoughts, that the cave agreed to hold them, on the condition it would never speak of what it held. And so, when the moon came to check on its secrets, the cave shut its mouth, tightly. No one ever entered after moonrise, not even when shelter was needed. They would walk farther, freeze, even, if it came to it. Better to risk the teeth of night, than the silence inside that stone. But still, on rare nights, someone would stand at the edge, not to enter, just to listen. Because if you timed it right, if you stood very still, with your back to the moon, and your feet cold in the moss, you might hear it, just once. A breath, a long slow exhale, not wind, not echo, something older, deeper, as if the cave too remembered what it meant to breathe, and hated it. Why they feared reflections in still water. It wasn't fear of drowning, that came later. This was older, quieter, a kind of fear that settled in the chest when the air went too still and the water stopped moving. There were no splashes, no insects skating the surface, no breeze, just a silence so deep it felt like the world had been holding its breath, and the pool was holding something else. They didn't look into still water, without reason, not even the bravest among them. A pool that did not move was treated with the same caution as a cave with no echo or a clearing where no birds sang. They knew what reflections were, not as images, not as science, but as presence. The way another version of you could appear, just beneath your feet, looking up, mimicking your movements, but not quite perfectly. It was the not quite that unsettled them most. When a face stared back, there was a moment, always a moment, where you weren't sure who moved first. Was it you, or the reflection? Because sometimes, especially in the deepest pools, the image didn't seem like a copy. It seemed like a twin who'd been waiting. Someone who'd been down there longer than you'd been alive. Someone patient. There were stories, of course. Warnings passed down not with fear, but with a kind of hush. One told of a man who saw something in the water that wasn't him. The shape looked like him. Same eyes, same shoulders, same scars, but it smiled differently. It blinked too slowly, and when he leaned closer to see if it really matched his face, he never stood up again. They found him kneeling, breath shallow, eyes wide open. Alive, but not all the way there. Like something had been switched. The elders believed the water held memory, not like the memory you speak, but memory that lived in the ground. That when the world was new and soft, every creature that passed left behind a shadow, and the still places, the unmoving water, trapped those shadows, held them there. Faces without names, thoughts without voices, watching, always watching, waiting for someone to notice them. You didn't drink from those pools, even if you were thirsty. The clan would walk miles to flowing water before dipping a hand into something that stared back. If an animal was found drowned in one, and sometimes they were, no one touched the body, they left it there. Some said those creatures had seen themselves and forgotten which side they belonged to. When a child accidentally glimpsed their own face in the water, an elder would act quickly, not with anger, with rhythm. They'd smear ash across the child's forehead, speak a line only passed between firekeepers, burn a tuft of dried grass beside their ear, then they'd turn the child around 3 times. Not for magic, for memory. To remind the child of which side of the reflection they lived on. It wasn't always dangerous. Sometimes the pools showed things the clan couldn't explain. A bird that hadn't flown yet. A face of someone who'd been gone too long. A pattern of stars in the water that hadn't reached the sky, and those were just as feared, because still water didn't lie. It just remembered too much. More than a human should see, more than a single mind could hold. On some nights, especially when the moon was full and high, a few would say the reflections deepened, became slower, that the faces under the surface were older than the ones above, that if you watched too long your reflection might blink after you did, or not at all. There were even rules for burial. No one was laid to rest near still water. It was believed the dead could whisper up through it, that they might see their face again, and try to return to it. Not out of malice, but out of confusion, out of longing. And if the reflection called back, if the water answered, then something might come through. Not always the person who left. Some whispered that the first time someone saw their reflection, it wasn't a discovery, it was a reunion. A remembering, that long before speech, before fire, before tools, something had watched from the water, and when it saw us take shape, it decided to follow. Maybe that's why even now, even in silence, even with all our knowledge and language and glass, still water feels sacred, or dangerous, or both. Because something in us remembers too, the quiet, the waiting, the face that was never quite ours. What the moon took from the river. They used to say the river belonged to no one, that it was older than the trees that leaned toward it, older than the paths carved along its banks, older even than the stars above it. But that changed when the moon began to watch, not with eyes, but with light, pale, perfect, and unblinking. The river shimmered differently when the moon rose. Something left it, or something was taken. It began quietly. The river stopped speaking. Not all at once, but little by little. Its chatter became a whisper. Its current slowed where it should have rushed. The stones that once danced under its surface lay still, cold, unmoved. It wasn't drought. There was water, enough to drink, enough to wash with, but it no longer felt alive. It carried no stories. The fish grew silent, the frogs disappeared. Even the reeds that swayed at its edges stiffened, no longer brushing softly in the wind. The elders noticed first. They sat near the banks at dusk and waited for the sound they remembered from their youth. The gurgle and laugh of water tumbling over itself like a child chasing its shadow. But the river no longer laughed. It waited, and when the moonlight stretched across its surface, it seemed to hold its breath entirely. That's when they began saying the moon had stolen something from the river. It wasn't superstition. It was rhythm. They'd lived their lives by the river's pulse, when to plant, when to move camp, when to fish, when to sing. But the moon changed that. When it was high and full, the river's reflections became too sharp. The edges of rocks were clearer than they should have been, and the faces in the water, they didn't ripple. They stayed still, too still. The hunters began returning empty-handed. The animals no longer came to drink at night. Tracks disappeared a full day before the moonrise. Even the birds grew restless, flying in uneven patterns across the sky and vanishing into the trees long before dusk. One night, a child wandered down to the water's edge under a silver bright moon. She returned hours later, silent, eyes wide, carrying a rock so smooth and white it looked carved, but she couldn't say where she'd found it, only that it had been handed to her by her own reflection. That rock was never seen again. After that, the clan began covering the river with branches at night. Not to stop it from flowing, they knew they couldn't do that, but to give it shade, to give it peace. As if hiding it from the moon might let it breathe again. And sometimes, in the new moon's darkness, the river would murmur, just once or twice, a small sound, like gratitude, like remembering. No one bathed during the full moon anymore. It wasn't fear, it was respect. They believed the river, exposed to so much watching light, became raw, vulnerable. It had given too much, reflected too many faces, caught too many tears, cooled too many burns, and under the moon, it had nothing left to give. The women began collecting water only at dawn. The men stopped washing their hands after hunting. Not at night, not while the moon could see. It was said that the river could no longer keep secrets, that the moon had stolen them all. One old man, the last waterkeeper, claimed to have seen the moment it happened. A winter long ago, with snow melting too soon and ice that refused to break. He said he saw the moon bend down, just barely, to kiss the river's surface, and in that moment, the river gave up something it could never get back. Was it sound, spirit, memory? No one knew. But ever since, the river was different, still beautiful, still vital, but quieter, as though a part of it had been stretched too thin, as though it had learned not to trust its own surface. They told stories about a time when the river spoke to the moon, freely, with joy, when it welcomed the light and danced with it. But something had changed. The river still flowed, still gave, still held the land together, but now it did so in silence, and the moon, ever above, watched on. Maybe the moon never meant harm. Maybe it only wanted to understand the river, to hold it the way it holds the tides of the sea. But the river was smaller, softer, easier to empty, easier to forget. And now, when people pass by its edge during a full moon, they don't linger, they nod, they thank it, and they keep walking, because something in the light still waits there, something the moon took, and the river, too polite to ask for it back, has simply learned to live without. Why songs stopped beneath the bright sky. There was a time when songs were as common as firelight, when voices filled the air not just in celebration, but in rhythm with the land, keeping time with footsteps, with the turning of the seasons, with the hush that fell before rain. Songs were how people spoke without speaking, remembered without writing, and felt without touching. And for a long time they were everywhere. But then came a night too bright, too quiet, too strange, and the songs stopped. It wasn't just silence, it was the kind that felt earned, like the world itself had asked for it. That evening the sky had no clouds. The moon was full, and the stars pulsed brighter than they ever had. The fire burned clean, throwing shadows that stretched too far and didn't dance like they used to. Everything was visible, too visible. Even the faces in the circle didn't blink as often. No one could explain why, but no one sang. The first to notice were the women who usually hummed while grinding seeds or tending fire. That night, they pressed their lips together without meaning to. Their hands moved, but no sound followed. The rhythm was lost, as if the breath they needed for melody had been taken by the light itself. Not stolen, just paused, held in place. Then the hunters, men who sang softly when returning to camp so the dogs would know they came in peace, walked in silence. Not even the dogs barked that night. They sniffed the air, paced slowly, and lay down with their backs to the fire, facing outward, toward the trees, as though waiting. Children, too, stopped their little games. They didn't chant or echo what they'd heard around the circle. Even the rocks they played with seemed still, like they knew something wasn't right. A few toddlers tried to whisper songs to themselves, songs they'd heard sung to them at night, but their voices faded before they could finish a verse. Their eyes darted up toward the sky, confused, uncertain. The sky was too bright, not in color or heat, but in knowing. That's what the elders said later, in hushed tones. that the brightness wasn't just light, it was awareness. The sky saw too much that night. It looked back, it pressed in, it watched, and under that gaze no one dared to offer a sound that wasn't necessary. A footstep, a cough, a creak of wood, but no songs. They used to say the gods liked music, that they came closer when people sang, that melodies called down stories and chased away wandering spirits. But this night, this sky, felt like it belonged to something else. Not cruel, just older than gods, more silent, less interested in human offerings. It didn't want to be sung to, it wanted stillness. No one said it aloud, but they all knew if someone had started a song that night, something would have changed. Something watching might have answered, and they weren't sure they wanted a reply. So the old songs stayed in their chests, the lullabies, the chants, the verses about stars and fire, and the names of lost kin. They were there just beneath the surface, but the people swallowed them like breath held too long, waiting for something to shift. The next morning, the sky looked ordinary again, pale blue, thin clouds, a breeze, birds returned to their calls. The trees moved like they always had, but still the songs didn't return right away. Not for days, not until someone without thinking began to hum while weaving bark into rope, just a thread of sound, nothing more. Others joined later, slowly, like walking into a cold stream. The songs came back, softer, less certain, but they came. Still no one sang on nights like that again, when the sky turned too clear, when the moon hung too high, when the light made shadows stretch long and unfamiliar, because they remembered the silence, the hush that wasn't empty, but full of something waiting, and they knew that whatever had listened that night might still be listening, and it preferred things quiet. How they buried their fear in ash. They never said they were afraid, not directly, not in the way you might expect. The word didn't exist for them, the way it does now. There was no term for dread, no neat phrase for quiet panic. What they had instead were gestures, silences, and ash. And it was through ash that they tried to bury what they didn't want to carry into the next night. Fear for them was a kind of inheritance, passed from one season to the next, from those who remembered to those who were trying to forget. It clung to the cave walls in charcoal handprints. It hid in the crackle of firewood too dry. It lived in the breath between stories, and it always arrived uninvited, in the sudden quiet after laughter, in the twitch of a child's ear when the wind changed, in the way old eyes looked too long into the trees. But ash was different. Ash was final. It was what remained after something had already burned. It was what they touched after the fire had done its work, when danger had passed, or at least retreated. Ash was memory made physical, and in it, they saw not just the past, but a way to manage what frightened them. They would scoop it with bare hands, rub it into their arms, across their faces, down the backs of their necks. Not out of ritual, exactly, not always, but as instinct. As if covering themselves in what was left of yesterday's flame might hide them from tomorrow's fear. Children were marked in ash before long journeys. Warriors smeared it across their chests after seeing something they couldn't explain. Mothers pressed it into the foreheads of the sleeping, whispering nothing, but hoping it would be enough. Sometimes they buried things in it. Not just bones, not just broken tools, but objects that carried too much feeling. A charm that hadn't protected. A stone once held by someone who didn't return. The ash pit became more than a place where fires ended. It became a graveyard of emotions too heavy to hold, and still, they never spoke the word fear. They said the cold came too close, or the wind knew our names last night, or the fire wouldn't listen. They had 1,000 ways to describe it without naming it, because names gave power, and fear, they believed, already had enough of that. There were stories too about the ash remembering, about it knowing who had come close to the edge and turned away just in time, about how the fire whispered to the ash, and the ash whispered back. Some said you could hear it. If you lay down very still with your ear against the pile, you might catch a sound like breathing, or sobbing, or warning. No one did that twice. Still, ash was safe, or as close as anything came to safety. It was what came after heat, after light, after danger. It was cooling proof that someone had survived. And so they kept it close, spread it around the edges of the sleeping circle, marked the entry to their caves with it, brushed it into the cracks between stones, where they believed shadows might try to slip through. Fear couldn't be avoided, but it could be quieted. Dusted down, turned into something that didn't have teeth. Sometimes when a group lost someone to the cold, to the night, to something they couldn't name, they didn't wail or sing or speak. They gathered the ash from the last fire and walked it to where the person had last stood. They poured it slowly, carefully, covering the ground in a thin layer of grey, not to cleanse it, but to remember and to warn. When new fires were built, the old ash was never far away. A pinch tossed into the flame, a smear along a wrist, a handful scattered where the children slept. It was never discarded carelessly. Ash was what kept the past from slipping loose. And so they buried their fear in it. Every night, not because they were without fear, but because they understood it. They knew it couldn't be killed. Only cooled, only held, only folded gently into the remains of what had already burned. And in doing so they could finally close their eyes, knowing that fear too could rest. For a little while. The shape they carved to keep it away. It wasn't just fire or ash that held meaning for them. It was shape, form, line. The curve of a mark on stone, the hollow of a carved figure placed near an entrance. They believed deeply in the power of what the hand could make, not only as memory, but as defense. And there were some things too large, too strange, too invisible to fight in any other way. So they carved, not elaborate, not beautiful by today's standards. These were not decorations. They were warnings, or wards. Each one carried intention in its groove, in the pressure of the hand that made it. You could tell by how deep the lines were, whether the fear had been fresh or long held, whether it had come in dreams or on a wind that carried strange scents, whether it had taken someone. The shapes always began the same way, with a circle, not always perfect, but always closed. Then came notches, sometimes 3, sometimes many more. They'd chip into the edges, or score lines through the center. The circle wasn't just the sun, or the moon, or the eye of something watching, though it could be any of those. It was a boundary, and what they carved inside it was what they meant to keep out. Some shapes were carved on bones, left outside shelters to face the night, others on flat stones placed under sleeping bodies, and a few, only a few, were made in secret, on pieces of wood never burned, kept hidden in bundles of fur, passed hand to hand only when needed. The shapes on these were different, sharper, angrier. They were not just for protection, they were messages, warnings for the thing that hunted in silence. We see you, we know you're there. When a child had night terrors, the kind that left them gasping, eyes open, but unfocused, someone would carve the shape beside their bed. If the wind turned strange, or birds went quiet for too long, someone would etch it near the food stores, and always, before the longest nights, they would refresh the marks on the shelter walls, tracing over old grooves, deepening them, so the protection wouldn't wear thin. No one knew exactly when the shapes had started. The elders just said they had always worked, and in that, there was comfort. You didn't need to understand what you feared, you only needed to know what to do with your hands. They didn't carve alone, not always. In times of collective fear, a sound no one could explain, a fire that refused to catch, a strange pattern in the stars, the clan gathered, and many hands worked at once. Children were given soft wood, the old were given smooth stones, everyone pressed into the shape together, as if each mark chipped away a little of what haunted them. They said the shape had to be made with intention. You couldn't rush it, you couldn't look away. The thing you feared had to be in your mind, held firmly, but not fed. If you carved without meaning, the shape would do nothing. And worse, it might call something instead. There were stories of careless marks, of people who copied the shape just to learn it, without respect. Those stories didn't end well. The details were never shared. Just looks. Just the memory of someone who no longer slept near the fire, or at all. And when the carving was done, there was always silence. A full moment where no one moved, as if the act of shaping fear into a line had drained something from the body. That silence was part of the ritual, a kind of closing, a seal. Even now in caves long abandoned, archaeologists find these marks. They catalogue them, photograph them, call them symbols or proto-language, but they don't feel what the people who made them felt, that the act of carving was a kind of survival, that the shape itself had meaning beyond what eyes could see, because fear doesn't disappear, it only moves, and sometimes the only way to keep it away is to give it a shape, and make sure it knows it's being watched. When the sky was too bright to be trusted, there were nights when the sky glowed too much, and no one celebrated. It wasn't the brightness of fire or warmth. It wasn't dawn coming early. It was a strange silver sheen that didn't flicker or move, and it didn't feel right. The elders would glance up once, then quickly look away. They'd pull their cloaks tighter, even if the cold hadn't changed. And without speaking, someone would reach to cover the fire, shielding it with a flat stone or a pile of ash, dimming it until it barely breathed. The children always noticed. They asked why the sky was so awake, why the shadows had changed shape, why no one was laughing, even though they'd had food. But no one answered. Not really, just the same soft warning repeated over the years: don't look too long, don't follow the light. Because they'd learned slowly and bitterly that too much light at the wrong time could mean something was wrong, deeply wrong. The sky wasn't supposed to shine when the world slept. When it did, things went missing. Not always people, but memories, directions. The usual rhythm of things. Hunters would lose trails they had walked for years. Water would taste different. Fires would take longer to catch. Some said it was the moon swollen beyond its place, trying to take back what it once gave. Others whispered about stars that had grown too bold, breaking patterns older than any name they knew. But most didn't try to explain. They just reacted, hide the flame, quiet the camp, watch each other closely, and it wasn't just fear, it was instinct. The kind carved into bone from generations of being watched, followed, tested. The stories told of a time when people didn't fear the bright sky, when they danced under it. But then came the losses, one after another. The night the dogs wouldn't bark, the morning the river flowed backwards, the day every footprint around the fire pointed inward. After that, trust broke. They began to mark the days, not by the sun, but by the wrongness of the night. They counted how many full moons before the next too bright sky. They placed stones upright at odd angles, not to guide, but to remind this far and no farther. Look down, not up. On the brightest of those nights, no one slept. They sat with backs to trees, with ash smeared across their cheeks, speaking only in gestures. Even the bravest among them refused to speak a name under that light. They said names could be taken if spoken too clearly in a sky that listened too closely. And when the brightness finally faded, when the sky gave back the dark, it wasn't relief they felt, it was caution. The knowing that something had passed, but not far enough. The stories would be told again that morning, whispered with dry mouths around low burning coals, told not to scare, but to remember. To keep the silence alive just long enough that the next bright night wouldn't catch them unaware. One tale spoke of a child born under a sky too bright, whose eyes never adjusted to darkness, and who could walk for days without sleep. Another told of a man who looked up too long and forgot who he was, began to walk toward the hills and never returned, though they found his footprints circling the camp, again and again, like he'd been there the whole time. And though many stopped believing the old warnings, no one broke the rules, not really. Not when the sky glowed white-blue and cast shadows behind trees that shouldn't have had any. Not when even the wolves went silent. They didn't fear light, but they feared light that came without warmth, because they had learned, through loss and quiet horror, that not all brightness was safety. Some of it was a lure, some of it was a test, and some of it was a door they never meant to leave open. Why the bones were counted again after moonlight. They waited until the moon slipped behind the last layer of cloud before they began. The counting was never done under light, not even firelight, and especially not when the sky held too much of it. The bones were sacred, yes, but they were also reminders of who had been lost, of who had been found again, only to fade, of the nights that didn't end quietly. They were tokens of memory, yes, but also of warning, and so when the moon was full, they were left alone. Only after the light dimmed, not vanished, just softened, did someone rise from their spot near the ash ring. Quietly, they moved to the bone circle. No one needed to be told. They knew what was coming. The bones were always kept in the same shallow depression near the edge of the shelter, not hidden, not displayed, just known. Sorted not by name, not by age, but by weight, by texture, by the stories they had carried. And each time the bright nights passed, they were lifted again, one by one, and counted. Slowly, reverently. It wasn't superstition, it was practice. A way of ensuring that no story had slipped away unnoticed. A way of checking that none of them had been taken by the light, because it had happened before. Long ago, but not so long that it had been forgotten. The clan woke after a full moon, and found the bones changed. A femur was missing. A jawbone had been placed upside down. The circle had been broken and reformed without anyone's knowing, and the child who had been born that week hadn't cried since. She watched everything, but blinked too little, grew too quiet. Since then the count was ritual. Even if nothing had changed, even if every piece remained untouched, the act mattered, the acknowledgement. Because in a world where the moon sometimes watched too closely, and the wind sometimes whispered back, it wasn't enough to survive, you had to remember what survival cost. They lifted each bone with both hands, turned it once, brushed the dust off it with the back of a wrist, then placed it gently back in the order it had always known. Some were smooth from years of handling. Some were still sharp, jagged from a break that hadn't healed before death. But all were treated the same, and though they never spoke the names aloud, the names were there, carried in breath, in glances, in the way someone hesitated a moment longer over a certain rib, or held a cracked scapula like it still held warmth. Each one belonged to someone. Each one had a night, a flame, a song behind it. The children weren't allowed to watch, not until they'd survived at least 10 winters, not until they'd proven they could sit through an entire moonlit silence without asking why the stars moved the way they did, not until they knew not to laugh when the wind made the trees moan. Only then were they shown the bone circle, only then were they taught the count, because it wasn't math, it was memory. It wasn't about how many, it was about who. And after the count was done, after each piece was returned to its place, facing the same direction, resting against the others in just the right way, they covered the bones again, not to hide them, but to honor them. A thin cloth of woven reeds, a ring of ash, and finally, a whisper, not words, just the breath of the firekeeper, drawn across the surface like a blessing. Then they sat again, in the same positions, around the same slowly waking coals. No one commented. No one asked for stories. They didn't need to. The bones had already told them. The last night the moon was welcome. No one knew it would be the last. The moon rose like it always had, slow, silver and steady, climbing the edge of the sky, with that same distant calm. It washed the ground in pale light, turning every shadow into something sharper, thinner, stranger. And for once, no one turned away. No one covered the fire. No one whispered warnings to the children, or tied their hair in silence. That night, they sat beneath it, all of them faces upturned, like they were greeting an old friend who'd stayed away too long. Some even smiled. The warmth from the fire met the cool of moonlight in strange ways. Faces half gold, half silver, eyes reflecting two worlds at once. No one spoke it aloud, but the feeling was there. Maybe it wasn't dangerous tonight. Maybe the fear had faded. Maybe the old stories were just that, old. They sang, softly, the kind of songs meant not for dancing but for holding still, the kind sung with eyes closed and hands wrapped around knees, the kind with no words, just hums and low sounds made for remembering. And the moon didn't seem to mind. It hung there, full and bright and quiet, like it was listening. The elders said nothing, but they watched everything, and for a moment, even their lined faces loosened. Even they leaned into the light. The children were allowed to stay awake longer than usual. Some played with sticks, carving little paths in the dirt. Others curled against parents' sides, whispering questions no one rushed to answer. One boy lifted his hand and tried to pinch the moon between his fingers, and someone laughed. Not nervous laughter, real, free. They stayed that way for hours, but the stillness changed sometime after the fire burned low. It began with the birds, or rather, the lack of them. Then the cold came too fast, a sharpness not from the season, but from something older, something watching. The kind of cold that moved along your spine, without touching your skin. The kind that made people look at each other, and pretend nothing was wrong. And the moon, still full, still high, began to feel heavy. No clouds came, no wind shifted, but everything underneath it changed. The shadows stopped flickering. The trees stood too still. The air had weight, but no breath, and the fire, it refused to rise when fed. It hissed, it sputtered, but it would not catch. That's when the elders stood, one by one without words. They began to lead the youngest inside the shelter. No panic, just urgency dressed in calm. The songs had stopped, the hums had faded, and the silence returned. Not the comforting kind, but the kind that presses in behind your ears and makes your jaw tighten for no reason you can name. One last log was placed on the fire, one last look was given to the moon, and then the hides were drawn over the entrance. The light from the moon still spilled through the gaps between branches and seams in the walls, but no one moved to stop it. They just waited. That night, no one slept deeply, and by morning, the moon was gone. Not hidden, not chased away, just unwelcome. From then on, no one spoke of that night. It wasn't forbidden, just avoided. The way you avoid drinking from a stream that once held a drowning. The way you leave stones in place where bad dreams end. And though the moon still rose, still waxed and waned, the people changed. The fire was guarded more carefully, shadows were watched more closely, and children were told not to stare too long at the sky, especially when it was bright for no reason. Because everyone remembered the night it felt like the moon had finally looked back, and they never wanted to feel that again, so they let it rise, but they no longer welcomed it. Hey friends, thank you for staying with me through this long and quiet journey. This was what cavemen believed the moon could steal from them, and if it stayed with you, even just a little, I hope it brought some stillness to your night. If you enjoyed this slow walk through shadows, memory, and ancient sky, I'd be grateful if you gave it a like, subscribed for more stories like this, and shared it with someone who loves slow storytelling the way you do. Before you go, let me know in the comments, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it there right now? Until next time, stay curious, and may the night never forget your name.